Okay, here we are. Let's call this part 11B or part 11.1, but whatever. In part 11, I told you that I was going to make an addition to part 11 because part 11 became too long. There's a bunch of things that I want to explain to you. I kind of started into it in part 11 when I related the speedometer issue to you. Now, that issue might not be an issue. It could be resolved, and it could be resolved fairly easily. That one thing. They make speedometers that work off of GPS now. So you put the speedometer in your vehicle, and all it does is it tracks a GPS signal and tells you exactly how fast you're going. And GPS speedometers are very accurate, very accurate. The only problem is that speedometer is quite costly. So the reason why I told you about the speedometer isn't because the speedometer is the issue. It's the point of how to address issues like that. I mean, it's one thing to build a car. Say you take a modern car and want to build a hot rod out of it. You can do that, and then you can take the computer module and send it off to somebody, and they can program it or reprogram it or give you a tuner for it that makes the things that you do compatible with that program. So I don't have that option because there is no computer module in this thing. So I can't, take it and give it to somebody and say, I want you to adapt this to what I'm doing. That's not the way this is going to work. I want to keep this truck kind of old school. And so I've got to work out the issues of taking stuff, aftermarket stuff that they sell now, and adapting it to old school values, let's say. So I addressed the transmission, but the transmission isn't the only issue. There's just a multitude of issues. This truck doesn't have power steering, or didn't have power steering. The front axle that I'm going to get for it is probably just going to be the front axle. But do I want to add power steering to the steering box that's in here? Am I going to be able to keep the steering box that's in here? Those are some of the issues that have to be resolved. But there's one thing that I've got to kind of take a look at first is this truck, because it was a fire vehicle in New York State and old, was never titled or registered, or in that case inspected either. So one of the things that I have to do is, in New York State, if you have a salvaged vehicle, after you rebuild it, you have to take it to a state inspection station, and there's one in Buffalo, where they actually inspect it for the first time. And because this vehicle was never registered or titled or inspected in New York State, I'm going to assume that I have to take it to the state inspection station, and they're going to inspect it for the first time. Then probably after that is done, every year thereafter, I can get it inspected by any inspection station. But one of the things that we were talking about, and when I say we, my tool guy used to build race cars, and sometimes we have conversations when he comes in to the shop. He wants to see what I'm doing or how I'm doing, and I run some things past him, and he gives them his thoughts or opinion on it, and or will lead me to somebody that might have some better knowledge of what I'm asking. Remember I told you we looked at that brake system, let's call it a parking brake. Let's not call it an emergency brake. Let's call it a parking brake. Parking brake was rigged into the drive shaft of the truck. The only problem with it is that parking brake that's in there now is part of the PTO disengagement for the drive shaft of the truck. And I didn't want to keep that because I'm not going to have a PTO. Why would I need that? But even if I wanted to keep it, there's issues with it. There's a lot of play in it, a huge amount of play in that PTO unit, or PTO drive shaft disengagement unit. So if I did keep it, it would probably have to be rebuilt. Even if it could be rebuilt, I'm not sure there's parts still available for it. So I was kind of thinking, actually the tool guy is the one that kind of came up with this idea, and he says, you know, why don't you put a line lock, like the line lock brake systems that they use in drag cars, where it actually locks the brakes. In drag cars, it's usually the front brakes, so that you can have the rear wheel spinning while the thing, you're still staying in the trap, still staying within the lights, stage lights. I could use that. I could put it on the rear wheels and use that, a button, to engage a parking brake. But the problem is, he came back and he suggested that last week, and then he came back in this week, and I says to him, do you think that if I took that to the inspection station, do they have rules on it? And do you think that they would accept that as a thing, as a means of locking in a parking brake on a street vehicle? And he didn't know. He thought that that was a great point. So one of the things that I'm going to have to do is go to this inspection station and find out whether there is a book of rules and guidelines regarding vehicle inspection. Anything from braking systems, because the braking system is going to have to be gone through on this, and maybe you can see it in the background of where I'm shooting, but there was a very small little one-cylinder master cylinder on this truck, and that's not going to work. On cars, the major percentage of the braking is in the front wheels, because usually that's where all the weight is, and that's kind of where centrifugal force, not centrifugal force, let's call it, well, the physics of stopping a vehicle, you get weight transfer to the front of the vehicle. So you put most of your braking power in a car on the front brakes. That's not the same with a truck, because mainly the rear wheels of a truck are weighted, and you have more weight in the back. So on a truck, they usually shift the braking load, primary braking load, to the rear of a truck. Now, is there rules and regulations on that? And what do I want to do on this vehicle? Do I want to put the primary brakes on the front, because I'm still going to have a huge amount of weight in the front between the engine, transmission, and just general vehicle, than I am loaded weight with hauling a gooseneck trailer, because usually primarily I try and load the trailer over the trailer axles. So that has to be worked out. How I'm going to do it has to be worked out. How am I going to retrofit? How do I find, let me say I want to put 70% of the braking in the back and 30% in the front. How do I physically do the math to figure out what I need for a master cylinder, what I need for brake lines, etc., to go to the front and the back. Then there's the electrical issues. Let's forget about the speedometer, but there's other things. Where do I need to put relays? I know that one thing is the fuel shutoff, not the fuel shutoff that I showed you in part 11, but there's a solenoid valve that goes onto the P pump that actually shuts the P pump down, and that's how you turn the diesel engine off. That has to be engaged, but it's usually engaged through a relay because it's a pretty power intensive solenoid valve to shut that P pump down. And usually that's engaged through a relay. Well, is there relays and other things that I'm going to need for the electrical system? Is there, this truck wasn't, let's talk about electrical. Basically, the lighting is a very easy situation. But one of the things that this truck does not have is it does not have four-way flashers. And whether I need four-way flashers, probably not, because the vehicle wasn't equipped with four-way flashers. So to get through inspection, I probably wouldn't need them. But do I want them? Yes, I do want them. How do you hook up four-way flashers in a wiring schematic that you're going to do yourself? You could hook up a separate flasher to the wiring for both the right and left turn signals and do it that way. But then when you use the turn signals, I think that voltage would backfeed through, and you would get turn signals working both the right and left because you're backfeeding through the four-way flasher. Not the flasher itself, but this circuit. So you'd probably have to put diodes in to stop voltage from backfeeding into one another. The problems and the thought process that goes into this thing is just endless, and that's why you see me pause a lot of times, because I'm showing you something and then at the same time I'm starting to thinking of it in a different light than what I'm talking to you about it. Kind of the way that it happened with the engine when I asked the question in part 11, did anybody know about the tubing for the injectors? Why the spaghetti all that tubing around? Well, it's pretty obvious, or it's obvious to a diesel guy. The tubing has to all be the same length so that you get equal pressure to each injector. It doesn't matter if the injectors are firing at different time. You don't want one injector being subjected to, let's say, 10,000 pounds of pressure because it has a very short tube, and then another injector that has a long tube, and you have a lot more restriction and friction loss in that tubing only being subjected to 8,000 pounds. You don't get efficient performance that way. But again, there is just endless things that have to be accounted for, and some of that accounting for, I don't really know how to go about doing it. You can look on the internet. You know, people will say the first thing is, oh, you can search it on the internet. You can search it on the internet. Whether you find it or whether you find the right answer is an entirely different thing. Usually when, and I'm not going to say that old school was better, but before, people would write books on things, and stuff would be in books. Well, usually to write a book, you were probably a pretty reputable person and knew what you were talking about. That doesn't necessarily mean that when you find something on the internet, it could have been written by some schmuck that has absolutely no idea of what the hell he's talking about. And you don't know. I mean, you just don't know what you're reading or not reading on the internet. So there's a lot of research that's got to be done. There's a lot of issues that have to be addressed. One of the issues is going to be, and I keep thinking about this all the time, where am I going to stage all the electrical components, the fuses and wiring? There isn't going to be a lot of room in the cab. There isn't a lot of room in the cab. Do I try and find room in the cab? Do I want to try and put it in the engine compartment? And am I going to have enough room in the engine compartment? Or where can I put it in the engine compartment? Could I put it underneath the bunk of the sleeper? Would that be a good idea? Should I put the electrical connections underneath the bunk of the sleeper? What happens if something happened to the sleeper? Then I would have to take all of the electrical components out of that and try and put it someplace else if I ever decided that sleeper didn't work or something happened to it. It's things like that that are kind of time consuming and create me to pause a lot of times in videos, because while I'm running it by you verbally, I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe my first thought on this wasn't as good as, what I'm thinking while I'm trying to talk to you in a video. But anyways, there's a lot of things. One of the pauses that I did in part 11 is when I brought you over here and showed you the steering arm linkage. The steering box. I'm not really sure if that will work or not. Then the other thing I've got is the clutch linkage. How that's going to work out. There's a lot of things that have to be considered. One of the primary things is the axle, the front axle. What kind of a front axle I'm going to get, how I'm going to adapt that gearbox to it, the steering gearbox to it, whether I even want to keep that steering gearbox, because I'm not really sure, even though driving down the road in this thing with no power steering on it is fine. But when you're in a situation where you're trying to back up a trailer or jockey around to get a trailer in position to back up, there's a lot of times when you're cranking the wheel one way and the other in a very short period of time. And do I want to do that manually and not have power steering? So there's a lot of things that have to be addressed. None the least of is this wiring mess. So when I pause in a video, a lot of times it's because I've got something on my mind or something has come to mind that might need to be addressed. We talked about this PTO disengagement thing. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. I kind of told you that there's a lot of play in this thing before the axle moves, and you can see that right there. I can get probably almost a quarter of a turn. Were you able to see that? Or did that camera shift? I can get almost a quarter of a turn of play before it actually engages it one way or another. No, play isn't a good thing. I mean, could I get by with it? Yeah, of course I could, because that play can can be handled using the clutch. You can take the play out of it using the clutch. Do I want to leave it in there? No, because play is never a good thing. It's going to create harder wear on bearings and everything else. But those are just some of the things, some of the issues that have to be dealt with, and basically I've got to try and re-engineer this truck electrically and mechanically, so and then find parts for it. I'm not in the business of doing this, so I don't have a list of suppliers that I can go to, or a list of suppliers that I've gone to and can rely on to come up with good stuff. So just some of the issues.